Hello everybody, I'm John. This is JP Strategic Investments, and today I want to talk about Patriot One Technologies investor webinar. So let's jump right in. So first of all, I want to talk about some of the answers that we got during the webinar to some of the questions that I actually submitted. So the first one of those was about the false positive rate, and I asked if we could at least get kind of a percentage difference of the improvements on the false positive rate that they mentioned in the enhancements to the MSG platform. And Peter touched on that actually very early on in the webinar, and he said that the false positive rate after the improvement was about 70 to 90% of what they had had previously. He said what they had had previously was somewhere in the low single digits for false positive rates, but they reduced that, it seems, by about 10 to 30% if they're working with now 70 to 90% of the false positives that they had had before. So I thought that was a good thing there. 10 to 30% is definitely a pretty significant increase, again, depending on the situation that the platform is actually in, whether it's outdoors, whether there's a lot of interference, things like that. But up to 30%, that's a pretty significant increase there, so that was good to hear. The next thing that was mentioned was the amortization of the costs of the contract. So he did say that for the subscription contracts, they will be amortizing the costs of the subscription, or of all of the installation costs, all of the product costs, things like that, over the initial life of the contract. So for most of the subscription contracts, it seems that's going to be about 3 years. Any contracts that are paid up front, those costs will be recognized up front with all of the revenue. So that'll help us kind of evaluate the future earnings reports and things like that. So that was nice that that Peter went ahead and answered that one. The next question that I had that was answered: when do they think that they're going to stop receiving COVID relief funding? So if you guys have been following the earnings, you'll know that every quarter for the last 3 to 4 quarters, they've been receiving anywhere from $500,000 to about, I think, $1.3 or $1.5 million each quarter in COVID relief funding. And that's essentially like free revenue that they're getting. They've been using it for, there are certain requirements that they have to use it for. They've been using it mostly for R&D and personnel. I think there are stipulations where they have to use it to pay employees and things like that. They can't use it for, capital expenditures and things like that. But if that goes away, that would be a decent chunk of money that they wouldn't be getting every quarter. And Peter did say that they do expect, or the Canadian government has said, that the funding will end in September. Now, he did add on top of that that they have heard that before, and then the deadline has been extended, and they've gotten even more money on top of that. So that could potentially happen. But if it does end in September, at the end of September, that would actually be at the end of this month here pretty soon. So it would not affect the fourth quarter. We're still going to see some COVID relief funding in the fourth quarter, and likely still in the first quarter that we're currently in right now. But it's kind of up in the air, it seems like, whether we're going to be getting that going forward after the current quarters. So I just wanted to touch on that, kind of give you guys some context of how we're going to be looking at the earnings going forward. And finally, the last question that I had asked was just some clarification on what exactly directional alerting had meant in the enhancements to the MSG platform that we got. And it seemed like it was kind of what I was thinking in the video that I put out on those enhancements. Just talking about walking forward or backward through the MSG lane. It'll detect either way. It will show a picture whichever way the person is going, things like that. I didn't think that that was too big of an issue, but apparently a lot of stadiums had been asking for it, as Peter said in the webinar. So that's a good thing to see, I guess. Just more evidence that they are kind of working with the stadiums and kind of tailor making these improvements specifically to what these stadiums need. So the next thing that I want to get into here is we did get some confirmation that they have been closing and signing more and more contracts. There wasn't any specifics given, but Peter did say that they were signing more contracts. And I just want to play a little clip here of what exactly he said so that you guys can hear it for yourselves, just in case you didn't get a chance to already watch the webinar.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Look, I'm really happy to say that we have been signing and closing long-term contracts. Would I have liked them sooner and earlier? Absolutely. I think we just closed a nice one yesterday, if I remember correctly. These contracts range in size and they range in significance, right? I expect this trend to continue, right? As we get more and more of these high-quality engagements going. Are we going to announce those contracts? Yeah, absolutely. As soon as the customers give us permission to do so. Many of them don't want us to announce it, right? They've got certain things that they keep quiet. As soon as we're approved, right? We'll be announcing those. Have the demos and pilots led to sales? Let's get to the heart of the question. Yes, they have.
So as you can see, Peter says they have been signing long-term contracts and they would like to announce those as soon as possible once they get customer permission. Now, he didn't talk about exactly how many of those contracts were signed, how many of them have been in the first quarter, right, the current quarter that we're in, or the fourth quarter, so we can't really make any assumptions or predictions based on this about what we're going to see in the fourth quarter earnings or the first quarter earnings or anything like that. But regardless of that, it's a great sign that they have been signing more and more contracts, and as Peter said, that they expect that trend to continue. Peter also mentioned, in addition to this, that their partners have also been signing contracts as well. Here's a little clip of that.
Yeah, I'm really pleased. We signed a handful of deals with our partners in the last, I want to say, 2 months or so, right? And in fact, this fiscal quarter, a very large partner just signed a very large manufacturing company. So very pleased with that. Others are in progress with the partners. And in fact, some of the partners, as we've gone through a reevaluation of those partners, some of them are incredibly active right now. I think we had to tighten up how we trained them on what made a good customer to go target. And so we're seeing the benefits of that now.
So this is good to hear as well. Now we have Patriot One selling their own products and we have their partners starting to contribute to the sales as well. It really seems like we are starting to see a ramp in the sales process. And on top of that, Peter also did mention that their VRS was recently tested by a large hospital and a mid-tier bank with thousands of locations across the US. So it really does seem like they're going to be ramping sales here. Again, as always with any of these announcements, I want to see the hard numbers. I want to see it in the earnings report. But hearing Peter say that they are signing more and more contracts is obviously a much better sign than hearing him say that they aren't. The next thing that I want to touch on is something interesting that Peter mentioned called red teaming, and some tests that they did basically where kind of an outside organization comes in and plays the role of somebody who is trying to poke holes, trying to kind of find ways around your security platform, and then gives you feedback on it. And this was done in front of a large amount of sports executives. So here's a clip of exactly what Peter had to say on that.
Right. We had the opportunity to run a number of red teaming events, right, and evaluations on behalf of the NBA. And so for those who aren't familiar with red teaming, you bring in a third party who takes you through multiple tests to indeed validate that you meet certain security standards, right? We did this in conjunction with the NBA. These third party tests let us showcase our solution to all of those executives from the league and, to various other executives and organizations and things like that. The results that we'll be publishing soon, right? We were able to catch more of the prohibited items on the prohibited items list that are required by these leagues, right? And actually demonstrate that our technology could outperform the current security technologies at the required level that its leagues have stated as their minimum necessary and better than the products they're currently using. Right? On the screen here, we just got a quick example. What you see is a whole list of various products, right? Essentially, if you look at across the top, these were things that at the top row, the walk-through metal detectors couldn't catch, right? I don't know about anyone else, but I don't want some of these knives going into a stadium, particularly when you're getting fights and violence that involve 20, 30 people in a brawl, okay? Other than the item that was in green here, the yellow and pink, which are plastic, right? No one's invented technology to scan for plastic yet. We were able to catch all of these items. That's a unique differentiator. It's why we're getting such high interest from the leagues that, we finally have a solution that provides us better security than we had before with a much faster, frictionless entry for our patrons. So, this bodes very well for us as we continue to walk down the path of things like DHS Safety Act certification.
So as they said before, obviously we know that Patriot One's technology, the MSG platform, can detect even very small knives, but it will be really interesting to see this data. As Peter said, it was going to be published soon. It'll be nice to actually kind of dive into that data and see exactly how Patriot One is comparing, especially against the requirements of professional sports leagues like the NBA that they were testing with, and the DHS Safety Act and things like that. Peter also mentioned right after this that they had done several bake-offs and that they had won all of those and actually are in contracting stages with a customer as a result of that. Now, I'm not sure if that is the same customer and the same bake-offs that they mentioned in the shareholder letter, but Either way, if it is, it was pretty interesting. It is good to hear that they're winning all of those bake-offs because obviously that means that they're performing better than their competitors. The next thing I want to touch on is Peter also did mention that they are, now that they feel confident enough as a company with their product, with the relationships that they've built and the sales that they're starting to get, they are now looking into and starting to approach institutional investors. Here's Peter on that.
Right now that we actually have momentum with customers, we got references with the kinds of customers everyone want to have as a reference. It's time for us to kind of relaunch our investor relation program and start reaching out in a very programmatic way to institutional investors. I'm primarily targeting, quite frankly, into the US, both for retail as well as institutional investors. We haven't done that very much previously, right? And frankly, the company did that for too long. And frankly, we used up all of our marketing capital in the process, going out and marketing the stock, but not having any proof points behind it. Now that we have the proof points, we can point to valid deployments with referenceable customers. It's time for us to start that process again, right? We'll increase awareness. We've got increased customer demand, and we can actually point to customers who are deploying, and will be references to validate our vision of what we're delivering into the industry. And so we're starting that process, and now speaking to institutional investors, and retail investors to help increase the demand for our stock, which then should in turn drive up demand, drive up the stock price.
And after this, Peter also talked about maybe listing on the NASDAQ and talked about the potential market. Both of those, because they're so up in the air, there's so many variables, I don't want to spend too much time on right now. But if they were able to get institutional investors interested in the stock, obviously that would bring in a lot more money, a lot more demand for the stock, and probably, as he said, push the stock price up. Lastly, he did specifically mention some things around DHS safety certification and why there is a little bit of a delay in actually getting the certification.
That process is underway. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, the DHS is way behind in the process. What would normally take a fairly short period of time is very, very lengthy these days. So rather than just kind of waiting and kind of twiddling our thumbs, what we decided to do was undertake a number of other certifications with a number of third-party organizations. I mentioned the red teaming with the NBA earlier this month, and those reports came out very, very well, highlighting that we are, in fact, much more secure than the current technologies that have been used, right? We're going through all sorts of other certifications to provide a long list of third-party validations. These have shown that we are DHS Safety Act certifiable, and we've gone through all the right steps to get certified. We're now kind of waiting on the DHS to finish their work.
So not the greatest thing to hear that they're having some delays getting that certification, but it is good to hear that they aren't just waiting around for that certification. They're doing these red team tests. They're doing getting these other certifications that at least allows them to go to these leagues, go to these teams and say, hey, we don't have the certification yet. It's in the process of happening, but here's basically the documentation and the certifications that show that we will most likely receive that certification once the assessment goes through. It's almost like having a patent pending and showing the data that, hey, I'm pretty much going to get the patent. It's the same situation there. So it does allow them to still get the foot in the door, and it's great to see that they're not just kind of sitting around and waiting for that. And Peter did mention in the next 45 to 60 days, they do expect to make several announcements on different improvements, further improvements to MSG, and other things, as well as hopefully some of those customer contracts if the customers do give them permission to announce those.
I'm very, very comfortable that we're kind of turning the corner, right? And the investors are going to be pleased with kind of the trajectory we're on. We're at that inflection point, and there'll be a lot of upcoming announcements over the course of probably about the next 45 to 60 days or so that I think the investors are going to be pleased with.
Overall, I think we got some pretty solid information here, and the main points that stuck out to me are that they are signing and closing long-term contracts still. That was good to hear because the company had been pretty quiet on that pretty much since the last webinar when they announced those 4 contracts. So it was great to hear that. We also got some nice info on how they're going to be reporting costs and when COVID relief funding may be ending soon. So that will kind of help us better assess their current situation, how much they're going to be making from the contracts, and how to kind of assess their current cash situation. And lastly, I think the red team testing and the bake-offs were really good signs showing that Patriot One is performing well even when third parties are evaluating them, and is outperforming their competitors. And I will be definitely looking forward to looking through that red team data and exactly how they stand up to the requirements of different sports leagues and the DHS Safety Act. So those are my thoughts on the webinar. It seemed like the stock reacted in a little bit of a positive way as well, but we'll see what happens over the coming months, and I will be looking forward to the earnings report as well as that red team data. Other than that, I will see you guys next time and have a great day.